My name is Lisa Smith, and welcome to Enlightened Conversations. We are here this evening on behalf of the YWCA with two members of Disability Rights PA. The term disability is a term that I think most of us probably would not want to hear applied to us. Disabled, disability, not able to do or to function the way other people do. That's a hard term to hear when it's applied to yourself or to someone that you love. But it's a fact of life for many of us. And for many of us, it really impacts the way we work as well as the way we go about our daily lives. We are going to be exploring this topic, hopefully over the course of several enlightened conversations and looking at various aspects of it. Tonight, we have two experts with us from Disability Rights PA who are going to talk to us about how the aspect of disability and disability rights impacts your employment and your ability to earn a living. We have with us Bryn Madway, who's an attorney at Disability Rights PA. She works on investigations, monitoring, and case services for people who bring cases to their attention. Dale Verchek is an advocate who works primarily with employment policy related issues, case services, and also serves as a commissioner on the Pennsylvania State Employment First Oversight Commission. We welcome you, Dale and Bryn, and I believe, Dale, you were going to start off this evening.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. There's a lot of information going to be packed into this presentation, so we're going to try and move it along as quickly as we can. But just to share with you, maybe we can bring up the presentation right now. Today, we have three main goals that we want to touch on, and really to speak to real work in the real world, and how we can be successful in that path with self-advocacy resources and rights information. So three main goals we're going to focus on today is we're going to try and increase that knowledge of rights and responsibilities as employees, or those who support them under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to learn various strategies that are used by people with disabilities to get and maintain competitive employment. And the third goal is to gain an understanding of community resources that are available to assist with competitive integrated employment and reasonable accommodations at work. And so, competitive integrated employment is not a new term, but it is really making its highlight into the world of employment, because that's what we want to see everybody in. Competitive integrated work. And we also want to see employers accommodating folks so that they can have the best chance at meaningful work. So yeah, let's advance to the next slides. So we went over the goals. And the next slide number 3, it just talks about us, Disability Rights Pennsylvania, as an organization. So we are an independent nonprofit corporation under Section 501c3 of the IRS tax code. And we are designated by the governor as Pennsylvania's protection and advocacy system. So there's one protection and advocacy agency designated for every state. PNAs, as they're called. PNAs are the primary non-federal enforcers of disability rights statutes. So we are part of this big PNA system, which is a national network of congressionally created, legally based disability rights agencies. And we have the authority to provide legal representation and other advocacy services under all federal and state laws to folks with disabilities. Our ability to provide legal and advocacy services is based on a system of priorities. As a nonprofit, we have a board. We maintain a presence in all facilities that care for people with disabilities. We will monitor, investigate, and attempt to remedy adverse conditions, as Bryn does very often. It goes to several facilities in Pennsylvania. And we also devote a considerable amount of resources to make sure that folks have full access to inclusive educational programs, financial entitlements, healthcare, accessible housing, and as we're going to speak about, productive employment opportunities. Next slide. So the next slide talks about our mission. Our mission is to protect and advocate for the rights of people with disabilities so that they can live their lives they choose, free from abuse, neglect, discrimination, and segregation. And the most important is we want a commonwealth where people of all abilities are equal and free. That is our main goal. And I think we're going to start right now with the employment discrimination piece that Bryn is going to take over with.
Thank you so much, Dale. So if we can move to the next slide, as had been mentioned, I'm an attorney with Disability Rights Pennsylvania, and I help to answer questions about a variety of different topics from the folks who call our live intake line. And we do get a number of calls about employment and discrimination. So I'll talk about some of the major disability rights laws that protect people when they're working. So first is the Rehabilitation Act, and this prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities who work for the federal government or at an entity that receives federal funding. And so that federal funding hook sounds like it may exclude a lot of people, but because so many different organizations are getting federal money, it really ends up providing a lot of coverage because, for example, hospitals may be getting federal funding through grants. Colleges and universities are getting federal financial aid. Other nonprofits are getting grants. So while this won't protect everybody, it does create a hook and allows it to protect a number of people. Then there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities who work for a state government, a local government, or a private business with 15 or more employees. So again, many people are going to fit into this hook. Into this statute and be protected when they're at work. This is also a statute that creates a requirement that employers provide employees with reasonable modifications at work. And if we can go to the next slide, Pennsylvania also has the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, and this prohibits discrimination by private employers with 4 or more employees. So this is a little bit different than the ADA, right? Because you need fewer employees. So even more people are going to be protected under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. Other than that, it's almost the same as the ADA, and it also prohibits discrimination by state and local government employers. So collectively, when we're at work, we're protected by typically by 1 or more of these statutes, unless again, we're at a very small business that has 1, 2, or 3 employers and isn't receiving federal funding. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll start to break down what these statutes cover. So there is a definition of disability in the statutes, and an employee has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that causes a substantial limitation of 1 or more major life activities, or if they have a record of such an impairment or are regarded as having such an impairment. So that means that even if you don't have a disability, but if your employer thinks that you do have a disability, you're still protected from discrimination. So as we can see, there's a really broad definition here that really protects most people. Can we go to the next slide? So the statutes protect you if you have something that affects a major life activities. And what's really important to know is that there isn't an exhaustive list here. Instead, the statute looks at things like, can you care for yourself? Do you have trouble eating, sleeping, breathing? Do you have trouble walking, standing, lifting, bending, working, seeing, hearing, speaking, learning, communicating, interactive with others, and this is a non-exhaustive list. And so this is really important because it means that your doctor doesn't have to fit you into a diagnosis, or you don't have to have been fit into a diagnosis. If you have difficulty with a major life activity, you may be covered by the ADA, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, or the Rehabilitation Act. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one question I think that comes up sometimes is what happens if I have a disability that's episodic, or there are mitigating measures I can take? So an impairment that is episodic or in remission is still a disability if it's substantially limiting a major life activity when active. So something like epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or PTSD, these are covered even though they may not be affecting us 100% of the time. And similarly, it's irrelevant to determining whether someone has a disability if there are mitigating measures that have ameliorating effects. So for example, you still have a disability even if you're taking medication, even if you're using coping strategies, even if you're using hearing aids or behavioral therapy, you may still have a disability because the law doesn't take into account these measures. So if we can go on to the next slide. I was talking before about a qualified individual with a disability, which sounds really complicated, but it's easy to break it down because you just have to meet two requirements. One, you satisfy the requisite skill, experience, education, and other job-related requirements of the position. So you meet those requirements on the job application. So I'm an attorney. So for me to be a qualified individual with a under the ADA, I need to have my JD and I need to have passed the bar. That would be an example of that. And then I can perform the essential functions of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation. So what does that mean? I have dysgraphia. So that means I may need some help writing my briefs. I have a lot of trouble writing things down. So for me, a reasonable accommodation is that I have a tablet with me that I can use it so I can fulfill the essential functions of my job when I'm traveling. And so I'm a qualified person for my job. Dale, before we move on, is there anything you want to add?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No, I agree. This is even for a and I think probably you'll get into that, Bren, even for folks who have people who are dependent on them with disabilities. For example, I have a child who has a disability, and sometimes you wouldn't have to be accommodated for that. And again, Bryn will get into some of those details, but again, as long as you can perform those essential functions of the position, you're a person with a disability.
Yep.
Can
So
I
let's move.
ask a question here?
Of course.
And be for either one of you. Does the situation change, or does the application of the protection change if the individual did not have the disability when hired, but then later in the course of the employment developed the disability? Are
No.
they still protected?
They would still be protected. And
Okay.
there's guidance too on what the types of questions you can ask. So you may have an employee and not know, and you may hire someone and not know that they have a disability until they're in the position and they come forward and need a reasonable accommodation. Perhaps their disability is affecting them differently. Perhaps their job functions change. But no, it doesn't matter when you have the disability. If it's new, the employer still has an obligation to provide those reasonable
Okay.
accommodations once they're asked for.
Okay.
So we can move on to the next slide. And Dale was talking a lot about essential job functions. And so this is a very important slide because an employer, you have to be a qualified employee, you have to be able to fulfill your essential job functions. And so these I like to think of are the most important and core responsibilities of a job. And they're going to be different at each employer. Different employees are going to have different job functions. But just because a job function is on the application, just because it's something that you do, it doesn't make it an essential job function. So there's a variety of things that someone's going to look at to determine if a job function is essential. For example, they will rely on an employer's judgment. The job description will be relevant. The amount of time spent performing the function is relevant. The consequences of not performing the function might be relevant. There may be a collective bargaining agreement for union jobs, and that may spell out essential job functions. And then you can also look at the work experience of others who have had or currently hold the same or similar positions. So again, this is a very fact-specific issue. And as you'll hear me say fairly often that during this presentation, these are fact-specific questions, and so you may need to call us or consult with us if you have a question about what's going on at work for you or your job, because everything is going to be different for everybody, right? Our disabilities are different, our lives are different, our jobs are different. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what is actually protected at work? So it's broad. Discrimination is prohibited in any part of employment. So that includes job application procedures when making hiring or firing decisions, benefits and compensation. So you can't pay somebody less, you can't give them worse health insurance, advancement. So you can't take disability into account when deciding to promote someone. You have to offer equal training opportunities. So this goes to any term, condition, or privilege of employment. You also have to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities. As I discussed, an example of that for me is that I have my tablet. Someone else may need a little extra time on something, a parking space closer to the door, other types of assistive technology. And then there are prohibitions on certain medical exams and inquiries, and those can be very fact specific. So we'll move on to a question, a common question we get on workplace protections, which does an employer have to give preference to a qualified applicant with a disability over other applicants? And Dale, I'll actually let you answer this one.
So Lisa, do you want to take a stab at that?
I would think it really in a perfect world, it wouldn't matter. It's the qualifications. Whoever has the best qualifications should get the job, regardless of disability or not. Is
Very
that
good.
anywhere near right?
Yep. So yes. So the next slide will give you the answer, and it says no. Under the ADA, an employer is free to select the most qualified applicant available and to make decisions based on reasons unrelated to the existence or consequence of the disability. We'll go to the next slide, please. And so does having a disability protect an individual from being fired or laid off? Lisa, you want to take a stab at that again?
I don't think it does.
And you're correct. Next slide says no. The ADA protects a qualified employee from being discriminated because of their disability. It is not an ADA violation for a covered employer to fire, demote, nor promote, reduce hours, or change any other conditions of employment for a qualified employee with a disability if the reason for the employer's action is any reason unrelated to the employee's disability. So Bryn, if you want to add stuff to that.
Yeah, so I think what's important here is that the ADA is going to protect an employee with a disability from being treated differently than another employee. But employers are still going to be permitted to make decisions that are unrelated to disability. So you still have to get your work done. You may get reasonable accommodations in how you get that work done. You may need assistive technology. You may need other accommodations, but the employer is still allowed to impose sort of its general requirements.
Mhm.
Absent, if we can go, I think we went back a slide. If we can go down 2 slides. Perfect. So what an employer does have to do, however, is provide an employee with reasonable accommodations or modifications, which is something I've been talking about. So an employer would violate the ADA if they refuse to provide a reasonable accommodation for an employee's known limitations caused by their disability or disabilities. So an accommodation is a modification or adjustment to the work environment or to the manner or circumstances under which the position is customarily performed that enables that person to perform their essential job functions or enjoy equal benefits or privileges of employment. So if we can think of a lot of different things, and again, these can be very individual, right? So it's important if you're going to work and you need an accommodation to think through what's going to help you. So for example, if you have trouble during the commute because of your disability, you may need your schedule adjusted a little tiny bit. So you can come a little late or leave a little bit early. You may need to leave early for a doctor's appointment. So that's an example of a reasonable accommodation. Other folks may need assistive technology. They may need a job coach in the workplace with them so that they can perform their essential job functions. They may need Braille training materials if they have a visual disability, or a special phone if they're hard of hearing. So again, we can think through a lot of different examples of this, but the employer has an obligation to do this for the employees. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk about some specific examples of reasonable accommodations. So as I was saying before, you're entitled to accommodations during the job interview and application process. So for example, an employer may need to conduct the interview in a physically accessible location. The employer may need to provide a sign language interpreter for interviews. They may need to modify tests, training materials, testing time, and/or policy manuals. So for example, replacing a written test with a more extensive interview, or they may need to allow a support person to be present during the interview. These are examples of the types of reasonable accommodations an employer needs to provide. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here are some other examples of employment accommodations when someone's at work: assigning tasks orally, making the workplace accessible, restructuring a job to eliminate marginal tasks. So those are those tasks you do that aren't the essential job functions. Allowing break periods, it might be allowing additional break periods. It may be modifying the affected employee's work schedule. Scent-free or restrictive scent policies can be an accommodation. Allowing periods of leave, whether it's paid or unpaid, or modifying equipment. Can we go to the next slide? We also see providing qualified readers, reassignment to a vacant position, providing periods of leave for treatment or recovery, allowing a job coach, allowing a service animal, such as a service dog, even in a no dogs allowed area. Telework can be reasonable. Dale, do you have any other suggestions that you want to throw in that you've seen?
No, these are, well, we've seen frequent breaks, or allowing a person to eat at their desk if they have, especially if they have diabetes and need to have that extra, meal with them to keep insulin levels up. Even a space maybe to take medication, a private space, that can be an accommodation. So yeah, so it really is so based on the individual's need to be successful at work. So really, we've seen a variety of things being offered as accommodations.
Yeah, and one suggestion that I have for folks that I talk about a lot is the Job Accommodation Network. Their website is askjan, askjan.org. Is a website that helps folks with questions related to accommodations. It can be useful both for employees and employers, and they have a lot of resources up there. So if you need to source an accommodation because you're not sure what will work for you, that can be a great way to find accommodations or examples of accommodations. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Can I ask a question here before we move off of those
Sure.
accommodations? Dale, you mentioned about a place for like people who need to take a meal or something to keep the insulin up. Reminded me of nursing mothers. Is a nursing mother during that time period, the need to pump milk at regular times to then send, take home at the end of the day or send home for her child. Is that something that would be covered under these laws?
Actually, the EEOC just put out, Brent, correct me if I'm wrong, but they just put out some guidance on that to protect um, uh, new mothers to be able to pump when they're nursing, or to be provided a special place. For example, not a bathroom, you know, and so there is EEOC guidance. I just have to look to see where it was said, but it was fairly recently. Bryn, do you remember seeing any of that?
I remember it coming through. It's been I haven't looked at it today or yesterday, so I don't want to speak to it, but I don't think it would be an ADA issue, but I know there's guidance on it.
There is okay, good. It's good to know. Thank you.
So we can move. Oh, so perfect. So to get a reasonable accommodation, a qualified employee has to ask for it. And that triggers an interactive process, which may mean compromise. So what I like to say to folks is the way this works ideally is that you would say to your employer, I have a disability and I would like an accommodation. And your employer is then supposed to engage in a process with you that may involve some negotiation to arrive at an accommodation. It doesn't have to be exactly what you asked for, but it has to be effective. Employers can provide extra accommodations. They don't have to provide personal devices. So I wear glasses. My job doesn't have to provide me with glasses. Those are a personal device. But again, the process here is supposed to be collaborative. And when it's collaborative, it often works really well because it gives both sides an opportunity to figure out what will work well for the employee and the employer. Employers don't, however, have to extend accommodation to individuals who are protected solely because they are regarded as having a disability or associated with a person who has a disability. So you need to have a disability to get a reasonable accommodation at work. Can we go on to the next slide? So there are times when an accommodation isn't required. So employers are not required to provide an accommodation that would be an undue hardship for the employer, an accommodation that would be a direct threat to the health or safety of the employee or others, or an accommodation is unreasonable. And so we say an accommodation is unreasonable when it would involve reallocating those essential job functions, leave an employee unqualified, lower production standards, or excuse a violation of uniform conduct rules, require the employer to provide personal use items, or result in a change of supervisor. I think when we get into this territory, it's always good to consult an expert. So I would urge you, if you have questions about whether your accommodation is going to work, whether it's unreasonable, or if your employer has said no, to give DRP a call. We'll put up our intake number at the end, and you can call us and speak to us, and we'd be very happy to try and address these questions for you, because again, they are so specific. Can we move to the next slide?
So am I required to disclose my disability, Bryn?
You're not, Dale. We can move to the next slide. You never have to disclose your disability, but you're not protected by law unless your employer knows about your disability. So if you want to request a reasonable accommodation, you're going to unfortunately, need to disclose to the employer that you have a disability to get that protection. But generally speaking, if you don't want an accommodation, you don't have to disclose.
Okay, and going to the next slide. So when should I disclose my disability?
So I think this really depends on personal circumstances. I would never say to someone you have to do it or you don't have to do it. I think disability is so personal. But reasons you may want to disclose would include if you're applying for a position with an employer that has an affirmative action program, if you're working for a known disability friendly employer, if your disability makes you more qualified for your job, or if you're going to request a reasonable accommodation. And so there are some times when there are questions about this for affirmative action purposes, so state government employees or compliance with the Rehabilitation Act may prompt some of these questions during an application process. But again, I think it's a very personal decision. And so I think folks, need to decide what to do here based on their own experiences and their own needs. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer here. So let's move on. Dale, do you want to talk about our PABs?
Yes, I'm going to talk about PABs. A lot of people will call and say, what is PABs? I saw that on your website. And PABs is Protection and Advocacy for Beneficiaries of Social Security. I direct this program at Disability Rights Pennsylvania. And we go to the next slide, please, and just talks a little bit about what it is. So the Protection and Advocacy for Beneficiaries of Social Security, PABs, was established in 1999 when the Ticket to Work and Work Incentive Improvement Act was established into law. So under this particular act, the PNA programs are able to provide advocacy and other services when they have the PABs grant. And this helps folks who receive disability benefits secure or regain employment. Back then, Congress had recognized that people with disabilities were facing major barriers, especially they wanted to leave the Social Security arena for full employment. So Congress authorized Social Security to make payments to the protection and advocacy system in each state in order to provide information and advocacy services to folks who are receiving Social Security benefits who wanted to try to go back to work, to provide advocacy or any other kind of services so that they would be successful again in employment. And so the PABs grant is fully funded by Social Security Administration. And so, we're in constant contact with them because they would like folks to try and go back to work. Next slide. So some of the PABs types of advocacy that we provide, apart from employment discrimination, which is a lot of what Bryn discussed earlier, we work on transition services from school to work. Pennsylvania can start those services as early as 14 years. One of our goals in our advocacy efforts in transition services is to help youth, parents, and others involved in that transition to understand their rights to be educated and to go to work, especially as those issues relate to Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare rules, anything that applies to transition age youth, we will provide advocacy and education to. We also like to focus on educating folks about work incentives and benefits planning. I'm not going to go into great detail about that in this presentation, but we can always, have another presentation on work incentives in the future. We promote VR services and assist students and their families who reach out to us for help when they see barriers in receiving appropriate transition services. So some of the things we do is helping in post-secondary education, like campus physical accessibility, tuition waivers, classroom and testing accommodations. Under the new WIOA, that's the Workforce and Innovations Opportunity Act regulations, we're seeing a boost in optimism for supported and customized employment, for folks who have intellectual disabilities. If a person is entitled to the service, they will contact us for assistance in accessing these services. So we may be able to help them in understanding what they're entitled to and how they can access those services. We also do Medicaid, Medicare. We look at those issues. So helping folks appeal denials to durable medical equipment like powered wheelchairs, augmentative communication devices, appealing a reduction in the amount of personal care services or private duty nursing services. So anything that is basically a barrier to employment, somebody who doesn't have the right assistive technology or has been denied assistive technology will call us. Folks with transportation issues will call us. And housing, people often ask, like, how is housing, a barrier to employment. Getting somebody's elevator keeps breaking down in their housing, and they're getting late for work and at risk of losing their job. That's an issue, right, in housing. So those are the types of PABS advocacy services that we will look at. Next slide, please. And so self-advocacy strategies, I always say you know yourself the best, you are your best advocate. And so one of the best ways to learning something is to learn from those already doing it successfully. So you really want to try and network. You want to know what is expected of you. So when you're working, ask questions. Find folks who can connect with you. Build a strong support system. Call Disability Rights Pennsylvania, and talk to us. So those are various things that, you can use as your self-advocacy strategy. Next slide, please. And, maybe Bryn can also touch a little bit more on this, but, some of the common problems that come up, scheduling conflicts, workloads, dealing with different personalities. We often get, calls about these issues like, I have a new supervisor. Oh my goodness, I have a new manager and they're not, they've taken away my accommodations. So always the whole personality clash. There are ways that you can work those through. Just kind of talk to Jan, ask Jan, call us, and we can give you some tips on how to work that through as using self advocacy strategies. Next slide, please. I threw this slide in because it just is helpful. It's helpful because it tells you like what you can do when you are getting ready for employment. And this is mostly for folks, who are in that interview process, who are kind of not sure, not yet ready or are not really not confident enough. But, sorry, I have my 4-year-old here screaming for daddy. So, again, be ready to explain those gaps in employment. Focus on why, as Brent said, why I'm qualified for the job. Again, it's up to you to disclose your disability or not. But, create that realm for yourself, to be confident in getting ready for what you want to do best. You want to be in a successful, meaningful situation. So, there is help out there if you need information. Bryn, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think self-advocacy is really powerful, and it's important for us all to be good, strong self-advocates. And I think especially when we're going to work, right, especially if we're coming right out of school, it can be difficult to do that in part because in K through 12 programs, our schools have an obligation to find students with disabilities and provide those supports. And it flips when we go to work or when we go to college or university, and we have to seek out those supports ourselves because that child find obligation goes away. And so I think it's important to I like to call it our self-advocacy muscle. And so I think it's important to work that up, talk with other people with disabilities, call DRP, go to Ask Jan, and work on like building up those techniques. And sometimes it's good to role play things out or just talk things through with someone you trust. I'd note just at the bottom of the slide, then about medical releases, those can be really important to just take a look at because there are limits on what an employer can ask for. They shouldn't be asking, right, for every medical record you've ever had if you ask for an accommodation. So if you run into that situation, I'd give us a call. If you're not comfortable providing that, because we can talk through with you what an employer is and isn't allowed to ask when it comes to medical information.
And the next slide talks about more tips, on when requesting a reasonable accommodation, really identify your limitations when you're requesting those accommodations. Try and submit those requests in writing, although they're not necessarily required to be in writing, right, Bryn? But it's best to do that in writing so that you have all of your requests documented. And then, be far reaching and exploring those accommodations. Again, Jan is such a great resource for that. And again, if you feel discriminated against, look at your personnel file and then, contact agencies like us so that we can guide you.
And so I'll jump in.
Mhm.
So Dale, I think you're right. There is no requirement that these things be in writing, but I think that's often helpful because, and we can go to the next slide. As much as I love it when things work out perfectly, and I think we should all hope that they do, sometimes things don't work out or there are
Right.
issues or problems. And if you have something in writing or you've documented your request, that's always great because then you don't have to rely on your memory or other people's memory. If I'm in a meeting and, I might take a note, write myself notes and email them to myself, or I may, type up notes and email them to everyone and just say that this is to confirm what we've talked about.
Mhm.
If things don't go right, there are remedies here. So it's important to know that unlike many other things, to file an employment claim in court, you have to exhaust your administrative remedies. And I'll repeat that because it's so important. For employment discrimination cases, you cannot go directly to court. You have to file with either the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So for the EEOC, you have to file within 300 days of the discriminatory action, or for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, you have to file within 180 days. So those are really short timelines, right, for those statutes of limitation. And again, if you don't file with one of those two agencies, you can't go to court. So it's really important to file with them if something happens and you want to be able to redress it later. You don't need a lawyer to do that. The agencies will sometimes offer mediation. And then what they can do is they can investigate it and then they can issue a finding, or they may give you something called a right to sue letter. And that right to sue letter is the document you need to go and file your lawsuit in court. And so it's very important if, this happens, to give us a call or call another agency to find out what your rights are and make those decisions. I often say, like, even if it's the beginning of the process, circle that date when it's going to run out on your calendar, because 180 days can pass pretty quickly without us really thinking about it. Even 300 days can. It's not even a year. So just circle that date, and that way, if you're not sure, you have something to come back to. And again, I'll repeat it just because it's so important. You cannot go to court unless you've gone to the EEOC or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. You can cross-file your complaints, so you only have to go to one, but it's incredibly important to do that. So we can go to the last slide. And what we have is the contact information for all three of our offices, along with our website. And you can call our live intake line. It's open from 9 to 3, Monday through Friday. And we have real live people, including me and Dale, who answer the phones and can get you into the system and oftentimes answer those questions right on the phone, so you don't have to wait for a callback, which is a great service. On our website, disabilityrightspa.org, we also have dozens of publications on any number of disability related issues, including employment. And so I also encourage folks to go on our website, take a look at the publications. And then you can have all of this information at your, disposal anytime you want it. So again, a great resource. There, if you have a question at like 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, you can go on our website and take a look before you call our live intake line on Monday.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. I never realized that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission would deal with these issues. I've had interactions with them before on issues of racial justice and racism and that sort of discrimination, but never thought of it in terms of discrimination for issues of disabilities and working and that sort of thing. So that in itself was enlightening. How many cases would you say you end up investigating in the course of a typical month or a typical year, or is there no such thing as typical? Either of
Well, we receive, I would say in a day, we would probably receive, Bryn, about maybe 40 to 60 calls sometimes
oh
even.
my gosh.
So we do, so that should kind of give you an idea of the caseload. Now, not every one of them results in an investigation monitoring scenario,
Mhm.
but those are just the calls that we get in for legal advice, and Bryn and the legal team handle those cases. And we have a group of advocates that will provide advocacy um, in case services. And then we have a team that's dedicated specifically to monitoring and investigation, which Bryn sits on that team and does, Bryn, how many do you do a month? I
Of
would say.
monitorings.
Yes. I guess it
I would
depends,
say,
right?
yeah, it depends. I think it's hard to say what the typical, day or month looks like. And of course, not every call is going to result in an investigation or a
Right.
lawsuit or a complaint. But I think what we can say to folks, is that we'll listen to you and we'll, try and provide you with information to the best of our abilities. And I think it's very rewarding work, right? I can, think back on all of the folks that I help, each day, each week, each month, to redress their rights, which is really powerful to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be. Do you
And
find that most of the people that you are dealing with, who come to you for information and guidance, are dealing with disabilities that are considered more physical disabilities or intellectual or emotional, or how would you group them?
it's a great mix.
Yeah.
We get folks with any kind of disability calling us, and sometimes folks without a disability, as Bryn said, will say that my employer is saying I have a disability, but I really don't.
Yeah.
So we have anybody. We serve anybody that has a disability, doesn't matter what kind of a disability it is.
Yeah.
And our attorneys are all wonderful, very knowledgeable, very experienced, and give the best advice. And, why not call disability rights for free legal advice, right? Good legal advice.
Right. Yeah.
So, we always encourage people, please call us, even our workload is heavy because we have a lot to do in Pennsylvania to make sure that it is a Commonwealth that is free from abuse and neglect. But yes, please call us.
Mhm. How long has the organization been around?
It's been around for a while. I think we just celebrated, wasn't it 35 years?
I think
Wow.
so. And we've been in different incarnations throughout that time.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
So,
we were protection and advocacy, and then there was disability law project, and they combined the protection and advocacy was more of the advocacy, and disability law project was more legal, and then they kind of collaborated together to form a disability rights network, and then we had a name change in I think 2015 or 2014 or 15, I can't remember. Uh, it was Disability Rights Pennsylvania.
okay.
So I'm going on 15 years with disability rights, completed 14 years. And so it's very interesting to see how things have changed,
Mhm.
with COVID and things like that. But, we've really, we never stopped.
Right.
Disability rights never stopped. Intake continued. We did not lose a beat. We just continued. Our work was different, but we continued that good fight.
Mhm. And it is a good fight. It really is because, no matter what the type of disability someone's dealing with, it's something that needs to be addressed and understood and prepared for, and accommodations made
Yep.
whenever possible. You mentioned COVID, and I've read some things about long-term COVID, or what do they call them? Long haulers, long haul COVID, or something to that effect. I'm not exactly sure if the medical community has decided on a name for it yet, but people who seem to have long-term effects from COVID. Has that yet entered the paradigm of being part of a declared disability, or not?
So I
I've
think,
read.
yeah, so I think this goes back to one of my earlier points, which is we typically are looking at how a disability is impairing a function rather than doing it by diagnosis. Um, but the question of long COVID is fantastic, and the EEOC has released guidance on that,
Oh,
um,
good.
because absolutely it can impact major life functions, and so it can be a disability. And so I would, again, and I've said this, so many times, I encourage folks always to reach out to us to ask us those specific questions they may have, because again, everything is going to be case by case, because how your employer is may differ, what your job is can affect things, and how you
Mhm.
are as an individual is also going to affect things.
Right, right. Yeah, just as that virus affected everybody a little
Mhm.
differently, it's
Yep.
going to affect this particular fact. Lou, did we get any questions or comments along the way?
Let's see, we had a couple of comments thanking our presenters, but no questions.
Okay, that means you were very thorough. So,
That's great. Well, I wanted to put a quick plug in, and if anybody sees this before tomorrow, we have Disability Pride tomorrow in Harrisburg at the Capitol. So,
oh,
we're
great.
fairly close by to York. So if folks want to head up to the Capitol and see us, we will be there, sporting our wonderful Disability Pride sweatshirts, and and giving you a lot of good information there too. So hopefully we see some of our good folks from York.
Yeah, great. That's good to know. That's good to know. And Lou, if you can, for a moment, just go back to that last slide, if that's feasible, to get that phone number up there again for people, if they have questions, or if they're seeing this presentation at a later date, that they would be able to call and talk to either Dale or Bryn or any of the other fine folks at Disability Rights PA, and get their questions answered. Can you?
Absolutely, one moment.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible to run through it backwards, or
Nope,
just go,
I'm there.
go
Let
to.
me get it shared up.
Okay.
And
There it is.
I'll read it too for anyone with a visual disability. It's 1-800-692-7443. Again, 800-692-7443.
And our
Okay.
website is www.disabilityrightspa.org.
Okay. There you go. Those are the places you go for the answers, or at least to get, sometimes you're not even sure how to formulate your question. So that's usually where I am sometimes with these issues. It's like, I don't even know what question to ask yet. So maybe start with the website, get some background, and then call that 1-800-692-7443. Well, Dale and Bryn, thank you both very much. This was a lot of information to take in, but I think it was a great place to start for us exploring the issue of disability and disability rights. As we mentioned early on, there's so many different facets to this topic. And I'm hoping in months to come, we can take a look at issues such as access access into buildings and that sort of thing, or access around a community. You had mentioned, I think, Bryn, it was you that had mentioned about having an interview at an accessible location. For some businesses, that's very difficult to do. So we want to take a look at that, and also maybe take a look at just general acceptance and how do you deal with the questions that other people ask, and that sort of thing. So, well, if you're watching this program and you would like to learn about a specific aspect that deals with disabilities, please jot down a note and send it to us at the YW, and we'll be glad to include that in our study of what we
Also,
can do there.
sure. And also I wanted to, another quick plug, October is usually the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. It's NDEAM. And so, I'm going to put a link in there into the chat with some of the great initiatives on a federal level that are being put forth to make sure that folks with disabilities are being employed, are being accommodated, and also information about our Employment First movement in Pennsylvania. It is a powerful movement. Folks within the public agencies, are doing things to make sure that people with disabilities are included. And so please, check out that website, check out the State Department of Labor L&I website to see some of the initiatives that we're involved with. And again, ask questions, ask tons of questions, and hopefully, the state will be able to provide those answers to you. So again, this is October is NDEAM, the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So happy going to work month.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I didn't even know we had a month. So that's good to know. That's good to know. So, well, thank you again for your assistance and information tonight. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everybody who's watching to please take a look at the YWCA Hanover website and the YWCA Hanover Facebook for upcoming events. We will have another Enlightened conversation in November. I don't have the date right off the top of my head right now, but we were going to be talking to Matthew Schaefer concerning what happens when one has finished their term in prison and they're looking for employment and housing and to pick up their life. So we're going to look at life after incarceration. So that'll be coming up, I think, the third week in November. So check the YW Facebook and website for that date, and for lots of other exciting activities coming up soon. And I think, Lou, do you have anything else to add?
No, it was wonderful information. It was some things I was unaware of. I'm sure our watchers will find this very informative.
Yeah, me too. I learned a lot. So thank you, ladies. And we hope to catch you on another time to talk a little bit more about these topics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Take care.
All right. Good night, everybody.
As we close out, our Facebook is YWCA Hanover, and website ywcahanover.org. And you also find us on Twitter and all these videos from Enlightened Conversations on YouTube. Thank you, everybody.